Hi.
Hi.
So my first question, it says on your Twitter that you're Jewish. Am I getting this right?
No.
Is it the right Twitter?
On my Twitter bio, it says I'm Jewish?
No, but like in your tweets. I don't want to be wrong.
I have Jewish background. I'm just trying to think of...
Okay, so as someone with a Jewish background,
Yes.
how do you feel about Bernie's plan for Israel, especially as someone concerned with foreign policy?
I love it. It's an absolutely necessary. My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid.
Okay.
All right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And the voice you just heard was our late comrade, Michael Brooks, who in my my very favorite answer in the Q&A from his Lafayette College lecture a few months before he passed. Think about that one all the time, and it's maybe particularly relevant for something that I just wrote, actually. So will come out on the Substack yesterday, which normally we don't talk about on the Monday night show, because usually I do a stream about the Substack with Stefan on Sunday afternoons, but I was actually traveling because I spoke at Jason Miles's book launch on Saturday in the Bay Area, so I was like driving all day when I would normally have been doing that on Sunday. But the Substack is called Judaism, Atheism, and the Language of the Sacred, a religious mini memoir. And it's basically, me kind of unpacking how I've felt about those three subjects at different points over the years, and a little bit of the kind of complexities of my family background and kind of my personal I don't know, for failure to find a less cheesy word on the fly, journey on some of this stuff. And so, despite being mostly about abstract ideas, like by far the most personal thing I've ever written for like anywhere. And it kind of ends on that same note from Michael's answer from the Lafayette College speech, that that while I have all kinds of ambivalences about religion and religious language that I get into in the essay, there is a certain kind of condemnation, I think, of the human rights abuses in the Middle East that I think sort of maybe most vividly and powerfully does flow out of that language. And I am a big fan of people, especially maybe who have less ambivalent relationships to some of that stuff than I do, and less complicated histories with it, who can kind of reach into it and sort of use that to ground condemnations of this stuff, because I think it is sort of like a uniquely powerful way to do so, and that's very, very helpful, especially as the situation in a lot of ways deteriorates. As of the last things that I was saying this morning, there's a lot of talk about a possible deal for a five-day cessation of hostilities while some hostages are released. I haven't seen anything yet that doesn't include the word possible. So we will see. But the latest numbers that I've been seeing from Gaza are like 13,000, I think we're up to, dead civilians in Gaza, including at least 5,000 children, people under the age 18. There is, I saw a number this morning that 1.7 million Gazans have been displaced from their homes over the course of this. That's out of a total population of 2.3 million in the Gaza Strip. So that is a overwhelming majority. And things are getting very, very grim, right? So like this is from a week ago, so there are a couple of specific references that are going to be a little bit dated because the situation changes quickly enough. But I saw on Breaking Points there was a debate, short debate between the two hosts, Krystal and Saagar and Enjeti, about whether what was going on in Gaza kind of rose to the level of ethnic cleansing. If you don't watch Breaking Points, Krystal, Krystal's a leftist. She's been on this show a few times, and it's a friend of mine. But Saagar is a conservative. I think, in many ways, a relatively chill one as conservatives go, but is somebody who I think is just much more reluctant to use what like registers to him as overheated language. And part of the reason I want to show this is because I actually think he's making the best possible case that could be made against it, but that's actually part of why I found it so disturbing, because I genuinely think the best possible case registers as pretty weak to me. So in any case, it's in two parts, but let's watch the first one.
This was a first. There was the U.S. actually allowed. They didn't veto it. They just abstained. They allowed the UN Security Council to pass a resolution calling for pauses in the fighting in Gaza. That's different than a ceasefire. But as Barak Ravid points out here, this is the first time the UN Security Council adopts any resolution on the war. And I mean, to me, in terms of what their goals are here, to me, it's not a mystery based on the statements of Israeli officials, based on the one I just told you about from the IDF spokesperson, based on the plans that were leaked strategically from an official Israeli government ministry that said, no, what our ideal situation is we push everybody, displace everyone from the north, then we push everybody out of the south, and we basically force Egypt and other Arab nations to take in this Palestinian population. This is something that members of the Netanyahu coalition have wanted for quite some time and have been openly advocating for really for years. So it shouldn't be any surprise that this is the goal, that the goal is complete ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And there were reports about how pressure is being put on Egypt to use their considerable debt load to try to pressure them into this. There were also reports that there's pressure being put on the U.S. to take in Palestinian refugees as well. But, to me, it's very clear what the goal is. The only question is whether they'll really be able to accomplish this goal. But I just think it's important to keep in mind where we already are in this conflict, which is for Gaza City was incredibly densely populated. This is where the majority of the population of Gaza lived, and it's gone. I mean, 45% of all homes within all of the Gaza Strip, not just in Gaza City, have already been damaged or destroyed. The millions who have been displaced from their homes, there's nothing for them to go back to in Gaza City. That's already where we are. So, are they degrading Hamas capabilities? I don't know. We haven't really seen much evidence of that.
House, yeah.
But I mean, we haven't seen much evidence of really going directly and targeting the military infrastructure. And then there's also the question that Elon Musk asked and that the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked as well, which is how many new Hamas members are you creating with these actions, which is part of, the lesson we should have taken from our actions in responding to 9/11. So for me, it's not really a mystery what their goals are, what their approach is. You can see it in what they're telling, their own population, what they're saying publicly, and the military actions that are unfolding on the ground.
Well, I mean, is that the goal of the Israeli far right? Yeah. Is it the overall goal of the Israeli military? I don't know. Like I said,
well, the Israeli military is just doing what they are told.
Well, the quote you read, I actually think was quite accurate, is that they're going for damage, not accuracy. Yeah, but that's kind of what I'm saying, is that they're basically willing to pull the trigger on a 15, 20% chance. That's just not something the way most Western military.
Okay. I think that actually cut off a little bit early. If we could go into the original and do the a screen share.
Yeah, just give me a second on that if you want to comment on on what we saw so far.
Yep. So yeah, this is like I think that Krystal is laying it out pretty starkly here in terms of the evidence that you could infer both from the actions, which is the most important thing. And I should also note that if you look at places where there have actually been prosecutions for this afterwards, the kind of countries where you could be hauled before international tribunals if you lose the war. A lot of that has been inferring from
First,
inferring
there was the U.S. actually allowed.
Yeah, so that's where we started. So we should be like, I think to pick up where the clip left off, we should be like maybe 3 minutes into it here. So yeah, but like then the other thing, and I think that in what we're about to watch, this could become much clearer, is that that Saagar in pushing back is trying to say, okay, well maybe this is the goal of the Israeli far right, where in other words, the far right in Israel maybe wants this to progress to the point of outright ethnic cleansing, but that's not necessarily the goal of the Israeli government per se. And I think in ways that kind of become clearer as the debate goes on, little mini debate, whatever we're calling this, right? The exchange goes on. That's a distinction that's kind of getting more and more tenuous, given the nature of the government that's actually in power in Israel right now. Like, I was talking about this with my brother a couple of days ago, saying like in some ways, obviously relative to the vast differences in overall situation between the two, but like it's a little bit like if not only had Donald Trump been president on 9/11, but like if the version of Trump who is like kind of liberals' worst nightmares when Trump was first elected, like what you could sort of be the most worried that he was, if that's fully what he was, that like that guy was president on 9/11. It's a little bit it's a little bit like that. And so I think that distinction that Saagar is trying to draw here gets a little disturbingly hard to draw given some of the people who are actually in government right now. But yeah, let's pick up where we left off.
That's just not something the way most Western militaries would act. That's a different thing, though, than a targeted, like, we're going to blow as much civilians up as possible. I don't really think that's what they're doing. I think it's more in terms of they just don't care as much about collateral damage. But there's an important difference between those two things.
But at what point do we go beyond quote unquote collateral damage when somewhere around 90% of the deaths are civilian? Mm-hmm. At what point does, listen, people can lie about their intent, but the numbers don't lie. 40% of the deaths are children. So at what point do you say, like, this isn't collateral damage? This is part of the goal of the operation as evidenced by what has unfolded thus far.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though, is that they just don't care about that number, and they would care and point to the one figure. I'm not justifying this. I'm only saying that the intent matters and what it all looks like it eventually is. So I don't know that
the intent does matter at a certain point when you have this level of civilian death and targeting of civilian infrastructure.
The intent matters in terms of whether they're going to, what the goal is and what they're willing to. So let's say that their red line was ethnic cleansing. They're like, this is our full-blown goal. Then that's not what you would do. You would do something different. Now, it can be a secondary goal. It could be one of those things that it would be nice. It would fulfill some political, objective, but that's not the way you would conduct that is what they did in between Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's what an actual full-blown ethnic cleansing was going to look like. They
laid out exactly what the goal was, and they have the phase-by-phase process. First, move people out of the north, then put pressure on the south.
Well, this is a secret plan. We don't know if it's been.
That's exactly what is unfolded thus far.
And then you
put off the table any other solution. So, for example, the U.S., which there's a lot of problems with this idea too. It's like, hey, let's have the Palestinian Authority run the Gaza Strip afterwards. No, that's not going to work for us. Which is no surprise because number one, I think Palestinian Authority probably isn't up to the task. But number two, they don't want unity between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then when you couple what's already unfolding in Gaza with what's being done in the West Bank with settlers being turned loose and basically running wild, massacring Palestinians there as well and pushing them off their land too, it's very hard for me not to look at the facts as they're unfolding and say, yeah, this is the goal. This is the plan that is unfolding. This is what they're pushing towards. And the only question is whether anyone's going to stand in their way.
Well, I think you think that because you have a very, look, I think that you're coming at it from a place of zero trust from Israel. I wouldn't say I have zero. Let's call it, I don't know. I have a neutral trust of both Hamas and of Israel. We're not willing to assume the worst of really anyone except for the Hamas terrorists, but specifically not the PA. So ethnic cleansing or genocide is one where you have an explicit aim of wiping out this entire race or pushing them out of the region. Now, is that existing in a document, which we covered here on the show? Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Is that the official plan? I don't know. There are all kinds of secret plans inside the Pentagon. There were plans inside the Pentagon to break Iraq into 3 parts. There was actually very seriously considered at one point pushed by Vice President Joe Biden. Does that mean it was the actual plan of the U.S. government? Not really. I actually don't think there is a plan. I think there are disparate elements within the Israeli government, some of whom want ethnic cleansing, some of them who have no problem with collateral damage, some of whom are probably much more Western aligned and are ashamed of the way that the entire operation goes. And this is like what the consensus view is. So that seems to me like it's much more like of a cluster rather than any explicit aim. Now, that doesn't justify what all of the deaths are, but it comes to how are we going to, as the United States, the international community, Israel, all of us, what does this all end up look like? I think it probably ends whenever the international community just rug pulls its support. There will be no, final determination on Hamas. There will just be a high death toll. There will be now a huge squabble over internal security, indefinite, and all of that. And I think it's more, in my opinion, is more terrifying that there isn't a plan, that there isn't a consensus plan. So I don't think that there is a plan.
You're right. I don't trust Israel, but actually at this, I'm taking them at their word. When you have security minister, security cabinet member, and minister Avi Dichter of the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, announcing the plan for residents of Gaza is Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it'll end. When you have Bezalel Smotrich calling for the, quote, voluntary migration of Gaza Arabs to the countries of the world. When you have Netanyahu himself comparing Palestinians to the biblical foe of the Jewish people, Amalek, who they are called to destroy, including women and children. I'm taking them at their word of what they actually want to do here, and as evidenced by their actions thus far, which are entirely consistent with pushing the population out of Gaza entirely. Now, again, does that mean they will succeed? Not necessarily. It depends on whether the U.S. decides that we are going to, accept this quote unquote final solution, and I do use those words very intentionally, of the population in the Gaza Strip, or whether we are going to step in and use the considerable leverage that we have. But I'm just looking at their actual statements and their actions on the ground.
Yeah, I agree, Krystal, but the person that you read is a freaking agricultural. That's like saying Tom Vilsack's opinion on Israel matters. Like, who is
He's a member of the security cabinet.
Yes, but technically Tom Vilsack is a member of the U.S. cabinet.
Well,
so
do you want to take,
I can say
the
US
president of Israel saying there are no innocent civilians?
Yes, that's much more important.
You want to take Netanyahu himself, again, comparing them to Amalek, the historical foe of the Jewish people, and calling for them to be completely wiped out, including women, children, and infants.
So I agree. I think that the president of Israel, who, by the way, is the head of state and actually has no power, but that's a secondary thing. It's still important for the head of state for what the statements and all that.
All right. Keeps going for a little while afterwards, but I mean, that was the main part of it. And this is what I was kind of saying earlier, that the thing that I find maybe most disturbing, looking at this is, that, if you're sort of somebody who's not just going to sort of like yell and be ridiculous like Eli Lake or somebody, but is going to like try to pay attention to what, Krystal in this case is saying, and, is like been following the news closely about it, and et cetera. And they're trying to make the best case that they can that this doesn't rise to the level of ethnic cleansing. It ends up being troublingly weak, that you get all like there's a lot of this weird game of like, okay, well, here are like 5 members of the cabinet who all called for genocide or total removal of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, but they're not like the most important members of the cabinet. And the president, the head of state, said this, that there were no innocent civilians in Gaza, but but the president is really more ceremonial there. Okay. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself did this comparison of, he said Hamas was Amalek, And he didn't draw out the thought, but like the disturbing implication of saying Hamas is Amalek, you go back and read the book of Samuel in the Old Testament, is that Israelites are commanded to destroy Amalek, including women, children, and suckling babes, right? I mean, that's what it says in there. So, maybe if you're really, really committed to this, you can find an innocent interpretation of Hamas's Amalek, but all of the oars do kind of seem to be pointing in the one direction here, and it's very hard not to see it in that light.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about this debate, I think there's kind of two things that come to mind, right? First is that we can't have 100% knowledge of certain things, right? Like in terms of like exactly what Israel's intention is, right? That's not something we can operate like with mathematical certainty, right? So all we can do is make our best fucking guess, right, of what will happen next, right? And then in terms of, so the point is like, debating whether it's a genocide or what it is, sometimes this stuff gets almost into like definitional stuff and word game stuff, which a lot of times is like what, right-wing people or centrist people really like to do, right? We can all agree that what has happened already is an atrocity, or at least those of us, on the left can agree with that. And then the question of Israel's intent, that's more interesting for like, well, what are they going to do in the future, and what should America do to try to stop it, right? So I think that's when that question becomes extremely pertinent, right? Of like what their goal is, and we're not, we don't have the knowledge to know exactly what they're going to do, but we can make a really, really strong guess, right? Like 90%, 95%. So I think what I'm saying is that he's clinging on to these like epistemic doubt of like the 2%, right? Of like, oh, maybe this won't happen, or maybe it's not, right? But like the fact that it seems like the preponderance of the evidence is that this is what they're trying to do is like, is just an absolute nightmare. So I feel like we should just take it extremely seriously. And there's really not that much utility clinging on to that small chance that that's not really what they're trying to do, or it's a secondary goal, unless you're making like a pretty positive, concrete argument that, oh no, that means that they're actually going to take a different course of action. So I feel like a lot, sometimes these debates kind of get flattened in a way that, make it easy to deflect. And I'm not saying that he really doesn't seem like a Zionist, but we can all remember that most Zionist talking points of propaganda have to do with some deflection as their number one tool, always deflecting, right? So to me, like if I'm debating a Zionist, I try to say, okay, but what you're trying to tell me is that this level of civilian deaths, which is like what, like she said, like 90% or something like that.
90%, yeah.
Yeah. Is that worth your goal? Because that's what you have to argue. And if you want to argue that, you basically have to argue that if the 90% of civilian deaths were worth it to kill the dozens of Hamas people that they killed, and that was worth it because Hamas was going to wipe out all Jews on planet Earth, right? Which is millions.
They definitely have the capacity to
do.
Yeah,
that's the utilitarian calculus that they're basically invoking, right? But like, let's argue that if we're really going to have a conversation. But deflections into like, is it on purpose? Is it ethnic cleansing?
Well, so the question of question of what's on purpose. And by the way, I should say, I saw in the chat somebody asked about. There was a line that's like, I think maybe a little bit confusing out of context, where Krystal said something about the PA probably not being up to the task anyway. This is just an artifact of us only showing you part of the episode. If you watch the whole thing, there's a line, I think before this section, where she talks about how part of the problem is that the Palestinian Authority is really unpopular because they're seen as compromised because of collaboration with Israel on the West Bank, right? So that's why she was saying they might not be up to the task anyway, but that was really a side point here. But on this specific subject of intent, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't want to bring on Samuel and Matt, but I had an article that's up in Jacobin today. And it's called "The Human Shield's Defense of Bombing Gaza Civilians is Morally Bankrupt," and it's basically just making a couple of pretty simple points, because the intention, the claim that's always made about intention is, oh well, see, the goal is just to kill these Hamas guys, and it's this unfortunate side effect that 90% of the people who die are civilians, which, of course, there's a way of being kind of horrifyingly callous about that, talk about collateral damage and stuff like this. And it's like, I saw, in fact, an Israeli friend sent me last night this Reuters article that, was about this kid in Gaza whose parents had both been killed and whose legs, the kid's legs had to be amputated. And like the opening line of the article is like, he wants to get up and he wants to see his parents. It's like just incredibly disturbing to read, but like in the in this this argument about intent, right? There's all this stuff about Hamas using civilians as human shields, and the one, of course, the factual premise here is incredibly suspect after previous wars, if that's what we're going to call these, in 2009 and 2014. Amnesty International did reports where they investigated this, and they slammed Hamas for all kinds of other violations of international humanitarian law. But on the specific claim of human shielding, they said there's really no evidence of Hamas directing the movements of civilians to shield military infrastructure operations. In fact, interestingly enough, by contrast, the IDF actually has very literally done that many times in the past. The Israeli High Court said they weren't allowed to in 2005, but that hasn't entirely stopped it in the years since then. What I mean is stuff like forcing Palestinian civilians to approach homes for them because they'll be less likely to be shot than Israeli soldiers, things like that. But this specific claim is often incredibly sketchy. And if you listen closely, what people are saying is not really literal human shielding, like in a hostage situation or like those Israeli tactics that I was talking about, but just that Hamas military stuff is close to various kinds of Palestinian civilian stuff. And the point I'd make there is just that this is not uncommon. Neither Israel nor the United States, for example, make any great effort to separate our military stuff from civilian stuff. I remember many years ago going to a protest at the military base in Fort Benning, Georgia, and thinking about the fact that there were residential homes lining the street that literally dead ends at the gates of the military base. So if anybody was bombing the United States, you can kind of think about for 10 seconds about how that would play out. Or in fact, right now in Tel Aviv, the building, it's Tel Aviv, it's not Jerusalem, the building in Tel Aviv where Netanyahu meets with his security cabinet during the war is this military base called the Kiryat, which we actually have an overhead graphic of what that looks like. And if you're saying, oh, where's the base and all that? Well, that's kind of the point, right? It's kind of buried in all of that, right? There are apartment complexes, office buildings, 2 different shopping malls at which I'm told that you can, like, any given hour of the day, you can see lots of uniformed Israeli soldiers from the military base eating at the food court, during breaks and stuff. So, this is, again, I don't think, either Israel or the United States puts a lot of effort into this separation of military infrastructure from civilians. And certainly, and in Israel's case, and for sure in the United States case, we have far greater potential to do so, right? Because, bigger, I mean, even Israel, it's a very small country, but I mean, it's obviously a hell of a lot bigger than the Gaza Strip. And certainly the United States is a vast and sprawling nation. Whereas the Gaza Strip is 3 times as densely populated as Los Angeles, and the whole place is all of 25 miles long and 6 miles wide. So, it seems like this kind of human shield thing makes the least sense there. But also, more importantly, forget all that for a second. Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, that the accusation is 100% correct, that Hamas was doing something that is literally equivalent to like that hostage situation sense of human shielding. There's something very, very strange about the inference here, because that's not normally, like, we don't normally think that if somebody's being used as a human shield, therefore their life is forfeit. And
I mean, unless you're Keanu Reeves from Speed.
Okay. Even there, though, right? I mean, they're trying to get everybody off the bus.
Yes.
That's
And he worked really hard to do it.
yeah, exactly. Like that, you normally think, like, there is a reason why in Hollywood movies and TV shows this is always portrayed as this agonizing dilemma, right? Because precisely because we would not be expected to cheer for a protagonist who just wildly sprayed gunfire at not only the villain but also the random civilians that the villain was trying to use.
I mean, to be fair, the whole point was to give the civilian a flesh wound to get them out of the way to then shoot the bad guy. But still, that's
yeah. By and large, would not be okay with that. If somebody, if a active shooter ran into a daycare center and picked up two children, and you shot one of them in the course of shooting him, right? There would be hearings about that. People fired over that. As well, there should have been, right? So we're talking in this case about thousands upon thousands of children being killed. I think the human shield defense is sort of incoherent on its own terms. And with that, I think the transition between these subjects has not been invented, but we are going to
well, we can speed our way over to our new guests.
Yeah, we can just we are going nevertheless to bring on Samuel and Matt. So I will see you guys in the post game for patrons, and with that, we are joined by Samuel Moyn, author of Liberalism Against Itself, and Matt McManus. How are you guys doing?
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the book, Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times, which I've been reading with great interest. I also saw Matt's review of it in Liberal Currents, which I believe we may also have. Yep, there we go. Samuel Moyn on the abandonment of revolutionary liberalism. And I just want to set this up a little bit because honestly, the main reason I wanted to do this episode is just because I thought it'd be, I will set it up and pitch some stuff in, but mostly I thought it would just be really interesting to see you guys talk to each other about this, because this is, I tend to, Samuel, I tend to think of you as a left critic of liberalism. That's the impression that's emerged from a lot of your other work that I've seen. And Matt is somebody who's comfortable doing things like calling himself a liberal socialist, is sort of a left friend of the liberal tradition, right? So it sort of seems like on the surface you'd be disagreeing, but I think when you dig into it a little bit, it's interestingly much more complicated than that, right? Because there is, let me just read off. This is the first. This is from the first paragraph of Matt's review. He says, liberals in theory and practice have endorsed capitalism and socialism, been pessimists and optimists, hawks and pacifists, and everywhere in between. For those of us who identify as liberals, many liberals of other formulations will seem deeply unattractive, a bit like that family member you have to spend time with at reunions, even though you wonder how you could possibly be related. And in fact, the point of the book, right? I mean, like this is something I want to be, really clear about, right? Because I think that even though this is a show that people, are more likely to be interested in philosophy and ideas if they watch it than, maybe other left shows. But even so, I think a lot of people, they sort of primarily use the word liberal to refer to like a position in contemporary American politics. But when you start thinking about the sort of liberal intellectual tradition, I do see a lot more points of commonality between you two, because there is, the point of the book isn't just to kind of denounce liberalism tout court, but to say like, oh, there's this really interesting thing that was going on with these Cold War liberals where, they were shifting in interesting ways from previous liberal thinkers, and in fact they were rejecting kind of maybe more promising resources for thinking about social progress that come from within the liberal tradition.
Exactly. The point of the book is to ask whether we can save liberalism from the liberals, and I think that, today there are a lot of post-liberals in American debate, but most of them are on the right. And actually, the right is a lot clearer that it is rejecting liberalism, root and branch. I think there's a healthy debate on the left about what to draw from liberalism, whether to save it from itself, the ways in which it might need to be corrected. But I think the left is more ambivalent about rejecting liberalism altogether, because liberalism was the first philosophy of political emancipation, socialism the second. And as Matt's pointed out, liberals helped invent socialism. So it's messier on the left, and rightly so. And I think there needs to be an open-ended debate about our relationship to liberalism.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And I should say, just to make my own biases clear, Sam's Humane was my pick for Book of the Year in Jacobin last year. People can go check that out. And his new book is threatening to become my Book of the Year this time round. So that's a little bit unfair to every other author I read. Elizabeth Anderson, though, is giving you a run for your money, right? So that's the competition right now, or particularly the book Hijacked. But I really think that this book is a vital contribution to exactly this debate that we need to be having on the left. And it really clarified a tremendous amount for me, particularly about 20th century liberalism. Because, as you know, Ben, I've often argued that I think that there's a lot in the liberal tradition that's worth saving. For leftists and just generally because it would be the morally right thing to do. But I don't think that should insulate us against being critical of the liberal tradition where we need to be, even very critical where we must be. And oftentimes this can become a really ambiguous kind of enterprise because we don't want to criticize liberalism so much that we end up ceding ground precisely to the kind of people that Sam was talking about. Those on the right who will say things like, well, if liberalism really is so bad, why not just trash it or get rid of it the way that Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vimili would want us to do. So I don't want to dive into a lot of the substance of Sam's book, since I'm sure we'll be chatting a great deal about Berlin and Rent and all the others as time comes. But I do think that this emphasis on Cold War liberalism as a point where a kind of liberal outlook went off the rails, if you want, is really attractive to me for a lot of reasons. I maybe would go historically a little bit further back than Sam would to Herbert Spencer and a few others. But I think definitely as a popularizing movement and as the ascendant form of liberalism throughout the late 20th century, I think he's really onto something with this book.
Yeah, well, so let's start thinking, before maybe we go, there's, I guess, a way to go backwards and talk about, some of those earlier liberal thinkers for contrast, right? But maybe we just kind of start out where the book starts out, with Judith Shklar, and this, and this sort of critique of what was going on with a lot of Cold War liberals from somebody who was maybe kind of about to become one of them.
Yeah, so just for background, not everyone's going to look at the book. It's a series of kind of portraits of people who either were Cold War liberals or were witnessing its invention in the middle of the 20th century. And Judith Shklar was a Harvard professor who, it became very famous in the end for writing maybe the most brilliant kind of version of the Cold War liberal outlook. Ironically, the year the Cold War ended in 1989, it's called The Liberalism of Fear. She died a couple years later in 1992. But when she was a young person, she kind of witnessed the creation of this view that liberals need to be concerned about the kind of state, its expansion, the road to tyranny that liberals might pave, and instead orient themselves towards you know, are kind of around anxiety and fear about the death of freedom. And when she was young, she witnessed the kind of birth of this view, and she rejected it. So I kind of dwell on this fact in the first chapter of the book to say, she didn't she wasn't born into being a Cold War liberal. She actually was bitterly critical of it, and she makes her, I think, a pretty compelling point in her early work, which is that liberals need to embrace the Enlightenment and the whole idea that modernity is about the emancipation of humanity. And if they don't do that, they're kind of undermining the whole reason why liberalism, as well as socialism and Marxism themselves,
Mhm.
came into being. And what she noticed that was a lot of liberals in the 1940s and 50s were actually approximating early neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich Hayek in kind of worrying about the Enlightenment. The Soviets had appropriated the Enlightenment, said they were its heirs, and liberals responded by cutting off their relationship to it. And she said, this is a disaster for liberals themselves. And I think she remains right about that. And, you know, the reason that matters is because she is kind of envisioning a version of liberalism that's radical. And she calls for a political radicalism, which is just a world away from Cold War liberals and therefore her later self.
Yeah, I would go even further and say that this kind of pessimism didn't just impact the liberal tradition, but even influenced various forms of radical left traditions, right? Richard Wolin has a really good book on this called The Seduction of Unreason, where he points out that if you were to read Western Marxism around the 1940s, for example, a lot of it was kind of mired in this very Adornian gloom, that the Enlightenment had serious problems with it and it needed to be reconstructed on a different basis. And then you flash forward to the 1970s. What's really interesting is a lot of former Marxists who kind of become disillusioned with the project decide that they're going to become quasi-Nietzscheans and embrace this very perspectivist approach to life. But what I think is really interesting about your approach to liberalism specifically is how you emphasize that contra what those of us who kind of grew up in the late 20th century might expect, it really was this optimistic, forward-looking credo for a long period of time, and that this very sunny kind of liberal outlook shaped Marxism and shaped the socialist tradition, even indirectly. And you can cite a number of different figures in this vein, people like Thomas Paine, for example, who's an important liberal and also an important antecedent to the socialist tradition. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what characterized this early liberal optimism, and can you maybe tell us why in your book you discuss how it faded away?
Absolutely. So, you know, my sense is that um, the the best way of thinking historically about liberalism is not starting with John Locke. You know, that's at least a century too early. In fact, it's during the Cold War that it became popular to think of liberalism as beginning with Locke and, you know, rights and property before the state. Rather, liberals emerged self-consciously after the French Revolution, and I think their goal is kind of to make the freedom and equality the French Revolution first makes so, you know, tantalizing, available to everyone around the world, ultimately in a kind of institutionally durable form. I still think that's our basic challenge, and it was
Mhm.
Marx's. You know, unless you think the state will just wither away and there's no institutional problem. And so, in a sense, liberals found the modern emancipatory political project, and they have to be optimistic because
Mhm.
freedom and equality don't just materialize; they have to be built and institutionalized over time. And you know, we can get into this, but that's why liberals embrace ideas like perfectibility and progress, because we need to think of history as a kind of form of opportunity in which liberalism's dreams come true. And if all that's true, then you know the one of the main problems is the kind of institutional one. And
Mhm.
it's absolutely true that early liberals, at least many of them, have a kind of naive view about the significance of markets and they embrace laissez-faire economics. Maybe if we want to get empathetic for a moment, it's understandable to do so, since, in relation to feudalism, markets make people equal transactionally. And a lot of people entertain the view that it would wash away old hatreds. Jews and Christians can trade, notwithstanding, bitter religious divides. And yet, of course, we know the market ends up being a device of new subordination, and liberals were slow to recognize
Mhm.
the new oppressions that Marx made so graphic in his criticism. Yet, I think in the later 19th century, liberals didn't enter it, all of them, a kind of early Cold War with socialists. As we've stressed, some liberals became socialists, like John Stuart Mill at the end of his life, a kind of Bernie bro before his time.
Yeah.
And then, I think there's just a big tradition of what you might call, liberal Marxism. All I mean by that is that liberals had to accept Marx's conclusion that freedom can't just be formal or paper freedom, it has to be made real. And the debate is about how to do that. And so, all this time, I think you can find a substantial group of liberals who are kind of working in this more uplifting vein. They don't see history as a scene of tragedy the way that 20th century liberals, and as you mentioned, some Marxists ended up doing fairly, because
Yeah.
20th century history was depressing at times. So is
Say the
21st
least.
century history. So I think, I have an account of, how we should think about this. I think there were terrible things that happened in the 19th century too, and there are early kind of Cold War liberals in the 19th century. It's just they don't predominate. And so what really happens is, in the middle of the 20th century, the kind of, depressive versions of the liberals get the upper hand. They kind of establish a kind of hegemony over the movement. And I think that has some baleful effects that we will have to get into, because, you know, um, ultimately these are just thinkers. And our big questions have to be, well, what is their legacy? What is their relationship to liberalism in practice? And I think there's a lot to say there, but I do think it's fair to note this big transition in liberalism from a relatively more optimistic to a relatively more pessimistic version in the 2 centuries we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have more questions, but Ben, if you
Yeah,
want to.
yeah. I mean, so, I mean, I guess like I want to make sure everybody has a sense of what you're talking about, particularly with regard to, the Enlightenment and views about the Enlightenment, because this is something that yeah, I'm just not sure how good a sense many people would have of this, but like you
Sure.
can sort of think of I mean, sometimes if you're telling a certain kind of historical story about this, like Enlightenment thought or something, and liberalism almost seem like synonyms.
Sure.
That you mentioned the French Revolution earlier, right? Obviously, in many ways, like is the culmination, of that kind of liberalism early on, and that is one of the things that you get into in the book is the way that a lot of that stuff is driven by a belief in I mean, just as simple as just like as a belief in the possibility of meaningful progress, not just in the sense that, hey, here are some injustices and those injustices can be corrected, although that too, certainly, right? But also that the sort of correction of injustices, that maybe people should have certain rights, and and look at, here are states that deny those rights, but is a means to an end, and that the end is that there's some kind of human flowering that comes after that, right, as a result of that, maybe, right, that you've like swept away certain obstacles to it, or you have maybe even facilitated it in certain ways, and that then the result is that is not just that, like, here are some things that cause suffering that will then go away, but that people will sort of individually and collectively improve as a result of it, right? Like perfectibility is a word that you use a lot, when you're talking about this. And this is sort of all over, Enlightenment, liberal thought. And there are, even in the 19th century, you've talked about John Stuart Mill, right? It's certainly in Mill, right? That's his point about experiments in living.
Mhm.
That that's the point of the experiment, is to to figure out the better ways to live for human improvement and for affectability. But a lot of these mid late to late 20th century liberal trends that you're talking about, view this stuff with extreme suspicion. That you, I guess you said earlier, you made the connection to the Soviet Union, but I mean, that's the sort of, there's like a story about like, okay, there's a way of telling the story, of course, of the French Revolution, where you emphasize all of the worst things, and and there's plenty of real material to draw from. God knows there is with with like 20th century Stalinism, and you sort of see these things as like, oh look, this is what sort of really ambitious agendas of human progress are going to get you. It's bad news. All you should be doing is trying to avoid certain kinds of suffering that can be, a result of, state illiberalism, right? So that's not just a shift in emphasis. I mean, that's a really radical shift in how you think about what the goal is.
And if I could add just one follow-up to that, what really intrigued me about your book was, and this is related to my own research, so it's kind of a selfish bit of intrigue here, was how you pointed out how many of these Cold War liberals actually made common cause with conservative figures, people like Burke, for example, kind of resuscitating his reputation, saying, hey, maybe there is something to all these critiques of Enlightenment rationalism that we in the liberal tradition ignored at our peril for too long, because now we're reaping the bitter harvest of it in the form of communism. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that was something that I found really engaging about your text.
Okay. No, those are both fantastic questions. So, Ben starts out with suffering, and that's the kind of focal point of Cold War liberalism, that the problem is suffering, and the most we can hope for is alleviating it or palliating it a little bit. And of course, in this view, the source of suffering is not the market or society, but the state, the tyrannical state, which you didn't say, but it's often true. And so Cold War liberals kind of, let's say, reasonably start with this phenomenon and say liberalism is about cruelty, and not its elimination, because that itself would be utopian, but its lessening. And you can understand, this view, especially given the amount of suffering in the world, the amount of suffering in Gaza right now, and so forth. But I think the whole view is kind of a betrayal of the Enlightenment and liberalism, that it was one of the products of the Enlightenment, because coming out of the Enlightenment, liberals say there's an enormous opportunity, and it's the opportunity to respond to millennia of oppression from kings and religions and traditions, and to create a society in which more and more people can be more free in more ways. Uh, and this is something that deeply, I think, connects liberalism of this kind with they're socialists, including Marxists, and in a sense, there are just petty disagreements amongst all of these people. Now, of course, it's true. The working man's anthem in the 19th century was about the wretched of the earth. So it's not like suffering and concern with it drops out of this account, but it's an account about pivoting from a world of suffering to a world of freedom of more kinds for more people. And it's something that I think we really should focus on, because um, I think liberals, really contribute something to modern political thinking that's essential. And it's basically saying, ancient thought was about being a good person, living a life that is worthwhile. But what that meant is conformity. to God's dictate or nature in Greek political thought, which basically says who you are going to be has already been determined by something called human nature or your nature. And the revolutionary kind of freedom that liberals embrace is to say, no, you get to make your life interesting and new and unique. That's what John Stuart Mill, said when he said the point of modern liberty is individuality and experiments in living, which you mentioned. Now that has to be something that we all can get in a collectively institutionalized way, in a fair way. But this was the spirit of 19th century liberalism, at least some of its canonical thinkers. So when you get to 20th century liberalism, I think what happens is that all of these high hopes are seen as recipes for totalitarianism. And that's why you read the Cold War liberals, and it's shocking to see Rousseau, the French Revolution, not just the Enlightenment, but Romanticism, which is traditionally seen as its enemy, all cast as kind of preconditions for totalitarianism in the 20th century. And so, in a sense, what Cold War liberals do is make liberalism much more conservative and drink at the well of modern conservatives and reactionaries who said precisely that, high hopes are a form of sin or transgression. They are fundamentally modern evil and will lead to evil, which the Cold War liberals agree with and just think evil is just the Soviet Union now. And they hate the Soviet Union so much that they, in a sense, cut a lot out of the liberalism they inherit. And in a way, this is an amazing fact that most of the liberals who become famous in the middle of the 20th century are actually conservatives. And they have disagreements with people even further to their right, like Friedrich Hayek, but they also learn a lot from him and commune with him, and the results are pretty disastrous later on.
And going back to Matt's question, I mean, this is like, okay, yeah, there's certainly going to be disagreements between them and people like Hayek, but it is, but going back to the sort of classic period of liberalism, like these are people who in many ways are going to be closer, as Matt said, to like Burke than to Thomas Paine, right? It's like, oh, you think the world can be made new again? That's, I don't know, that sounds like exactly the kind of dangerous utopian overreach that's going to get us guillotines or gulags. And Burke saying, and somebody like Burke who will, I mean, it's not like Burke's line is like all social change is illegitimate, but says, but you have to got to be like super duper careful about it, like as like incremental tinkering, or else you don't know what you're doing. I mean, this is very much the spirit of these kinds of Cold War thinkers.
It is. I mean, in fairness to Burke, I mean, we all read his response to the French Revolution in college, and you've got it right on. But remember, he was not a Tory himself, but a Whig,
Exactly.
and he did invent something new, a kind of rhetoric that deeply affected the kind of birth of conservatism in the course of the 19th century. There were other outright reactionaries like the Frenchman Joseph de Maistre, who becomes kind of lionized in some of his ideas by the Cold War liberals. And I have chapters where I talk about how interested they were in kind of Augustinian Christianity of the kind de Maistre voiced, which basically says we are fallen. You can't really do much with human beings because of original sin, and hopes are probably just a kind of rationale for disregarding our sin. And then there were kind of secular versions of this that, like psychoanalysis, at least in versions of it, that emphasize this kind of like death drive that supposedly it is not making human aggression and violence something that's historically produced by bad institutions, but instead is just inborn and non-negotiable. And that was a kind of secular version of original sin for a lot of Cold War liberals.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the most fascinating observations in the book, because it actually explained a bit about my biography. Because when I went and did my undergrad, I had a professor there who was an Augustine scholar, and that was always what he pushed on us. But even though he characterized himself as kind of a red Tory type figure, he was always like, we shouldn't abandon liberal institutions. We just always need to be cautious. So then all of a sudden, I was like, that's what Peter was getting at back in the day. But I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about some of the different.
To talk about your autobiography. I thought we were going to get some, psychologically interesting confessions of a young Catholic here. But yeah, go on.
Well, no, then we'd be here for 5 hours, and at the end of it, it'd be me weeping, right? But long story short, there are a lot of very interesting people that you chronicle in the book, and I don't know how long you have, so I don't want to bother you about every single one. But one of the more interesting chapters in the book, where you actually take the gloves off a little bit, is in your discussion of Karl Popper. So what I like about this book is you do take sides, and you are sympathetic to some of these figures more than others. I think it's pretty clear that you have a lot of admiration for somebody like Judah Sklar, but Karl Popper comes in for a bit of a talking to on your part, where you point out that he had these, for a long time, very influential critiques of Marx and Hegel, characterizing them as proto-totalitarian, and that was built right into their philosophical structures. And then you say that he didn't even really have a good grounding in the basics of their thought, relied very heavily on secondhand sources. But despite, the fact that his understanding of their work was very minimal, nonetheless, this was received with open arms by many people. And I can tell you again from my own biography, Open Society and Its Enemies was really popular in the mid 2000s when I was going to college. Everybody who was kind of centrist worshipped it almost as a biblical text.
Right.
Things are a little different now, post like Bernie Sanders and stuff. But can you talk a little bit about what Popper got wrong and why the book nevertheless became such an explosive hit upon its release?
Well, it's kind of a sad story, because Popper was a good philosopher of science, and became one in interwar Vienna, and wasn't very political until 1934, when
Which
famously
is slightly interested in itself, right? Because like a lot of the people he was interacting with and critiquing were extremely political. I mean, like
sure. Well, I mean, interwar Vienna is just kind of an amazing place for the left. I mean, the left controls the city, even as the right is rising in the countryside.
I mean,
1934.
Yeah. I mean, the Vienna Circle, I mean, like who are the philosophers of science is like interacting with and disagreeing with. Like lots of those people were socialists. There's Carnap, there's Otto Neurath was like a big figure in like the socialist calculation debate, with the libertarians. So, I mean, it is almost interesting in itself that he wasn't super political before this. But yes, you were said
it is. You're completely right that it's confusing how apolitical he was, especially given what else is going on, and then it's sort of sad what becomes of him once he does make a political turn. And what happens basically is that he scapegoats socialists at that time, his fellow socialists, for having lost Austria to the right, first the kind of Christian right, and then after 1938 National Socialism. And he goes to New Zealand, where he doesn't have a library. So in his defense, he can't do any research, but he writes this enormous book anyway. And I think the effects are kind of accidental, because he publishes the book in 1945, and it is just enormously influential, especially in the couple of years that follow, when the Cold War is breaking out and people are looking for a kind of binary to explain the fact that their crucial ally, this, with the Soviet Union having done more to put down National Socialism than any other force, is now an enemy. And Popper's scheme, which divides open and closed societies, is very convenient, becomes very popular. But the understanding of where totalitarianism, so-called, came from is just horrendous, because it starts with Plato, and then it moves through Hegel, about whom Popper clearly knew nothing, and then turns to Marx at great length, but with not, a lot of understanding. Although sadly, he then shapes a lot of people's understanding of Marxism in all of its variety, which again Popper knew nothing about. At this very same time, he's moved to London. Friedrich Hayek actually got him a job at the London School of Economics and allowed him to emigrate from New Zealand to London. And he's abandoning his socialism and becoming a neoliberal. He's at the first Montpellier Society meeting. That's Hayek's kind of libertarian club. So, I mean, I guess my central allegation against Popper is that, while he, I think, has some creditable reservations about the idea of laws of history,
Yeah.
on par with scientific laws of nature, I think he cuts the ground out from under that liberal belief in the 19th century that history is a form of opportunity for the realization of freedom and equality. That doesn't mean that liberals thought that it was an inevitability, that there were laws of history. Some did, a lot of non-liberals did, because a lot of people believed that kind of thing in the 19th century. But Popper, I think, made liberalism much less historicist. I mean, Popper popularizes this idea of historicism, which he associates with the Soviet Union in the end, and with the idea of kind of necessitarian kind of laws of history. And it's not like we need to believe in those. It's a mistake to believe in those. But I think the left kind of gives up on this original liberal idea, which I said is that freedom and equality aren't built in a day. They have to be emergent phenomena in history, and we have to have confidence that there is a meaning in history, that freedom is available to us in greater and greater amounts and more forms. And I think Popper just kind of undercut that whole framework of thinking, and so it's probably the reason I'm most upset with him of all the different figures I canvass.
Also, just just an extraordinarily bad reader, right? I mean, like, this is like almost like politics notwithstanding. Like, this is.
I mean, you have to read to be a bad reader, and what you learn when you look into it is that he really almost didn't when it came to Hegel, especially, but Marx even.
Yeah, I mean, the chapters on Hegel and the open society and its enemies are kind of, I almost sometimes think that they were written almost as a joke, because he seems to have trouble taking the material seriously for a long time. But you brought up a very interesting term that's also another one of the key terms in the book, totalitarianism. And this is a term that's most widely associated, I would say, with Hannah Arendt, who's another figure that you talk about at great length, not as a Cold War liberal, but as a kind of fellow traveler, if you want, to the tradition. Now, I say this again personally as somebody who was very interested in Arendt's writing early on. I have come around to this idea that this term totalitarianism is problematic, but I still think that there's a lot to learn from that book, and also from her pioneering analysis of Eichmann in Jerusalem. The specific biographical details of that notwithstanding.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, though, I mean, to maybe lead into what you're asking about totalitarianism while sticking with Popper, right? I mean, like, look, I was somebody, who in the early 2000s, like starting out grad school and all that, I was like very interested in Popper. I think in a lot of ways, I think
great philosopher of science.
And I think that, like, and also I think just a good enough writer to, like, kind of suck you in, to a lot of things that, I think that there are sort of very solid reasons to be skeptical about. But in any case, but I also think, so, like, part of that was just like philosophical interest for me, but, like, also I think that was a time when Popper was really having a moment, like, in even if you think about stuff like, I don't know, like Thomas Friedman, right, has in his, like, notorious Suck on This rant about terrorism in Iraq, you'll notice he uses the phrase open society in there, right? I mean, that's you're going to threaten our open society, right? Like, clearly he's got Popper on the brain. And I think that maybe sort of like early 2000s, like, kind of war on terror liberalism, for whatever reason, got really into him. But, like, I think that's also never entirely gone away, right? So I think, like, for example, I routinely see people who are maybe like who are sort of maybe left liberalish people who are trying to justify censorship or say, oh, maybe we shouldn't be quite so absolutist about free speech. And of course, they're thinking of like the far right as the people they want to censor, but they'll reach into open society and its enemies and pluck out the paradox of tolerance from Popper. And the way that this relates to what you were starting to ask about Arendt is that, of course, the whole thing about totalitarianism is that it's the sort of rhetorical function of that, is to sort of merge together Stalinism and fascism as basically being the same thing. And as this sort of like joint threat, and like there's no point making, distinctions against them, which you can certainly be very critical of Stalinist authoritarianism and still think that politically that move is very bad news. But I mean, but like Popper is also anticipating that, because like when he's talking about like not tolerating the intolerant or maybe not tolerating the intolerant, like it's not like he's only thinking about Nazis, right? I mean, he's thinking about communists there.
Right. I mean, the history of the term totalitarianism is really interesting because, before World War II, it turns out it was mostly kind of far right Catholics who first begin to use it in a big way. And, their idea is that, fascism is right wing paganism and communism is left wing paganism. And their alternative is right wing Catholicism. So, it's only after World War II that liberals begin to use it. All of the Cold War liberals did sooner or later. And, a lot of these figures met Arendt, Berlin, Sklar at these conferences that Sklar's doctoral advisor, Carl Friedrich, had at Harvard, which were kind of about getting together to kind of use this word consistently. Arendt, of course, had begun, the first 2/3 of the book we call Origins of Totalitarianism under a completely different title. It was just about the origins of Nazism, and then kind of saw an opportunity to complete a third of it, and she kind of claims the word as the title of her overall book. It's still pretty unclear what the first 2/3 of the book have to do with the last third, and she doesn't she doesn't work hard on a kind of theory of exactly what connects these regimes. She has no account of the Holocaust, just as an example. Even though there's a big section on anti-Semitism, the Soviets are, her account culminates in an account of the Soviet camps, and it's only later in Eichmann in Jerusalem that she, really kind of talks in detail about the exterminationist project. I guess the reason I included a chapter on her in the book is for a couple of reasons. One is just to show how much she shared with the Cold War liberals, even though she wasn't a liberal of any kind. She, also had very little to say about the Enlightenment or only bad things. She really did frame her mature thinking around a rejection of Hegel and Marx and their historicism. Of course, her alternative was very different, I think, than the Cold War liberals' kind of libertarianism against the state. And that's really important because she did care about political life as the highest life. But then I have a second reason for addressing her in the book, which is just to reflect on, the globalization of freedom. I mean, the 19th century liberals famously, and some of the best, like Mill, were imperialists, which means they thought about the globalization of freedom. It's just that their means were, outrageous. What I think happened in the middle of the 20th century with some of these figures is that, in a sense, their racism was even more intense than in the 19th century, because they kind of write off the world as, a credible place for freedom and equality ever to be institutionalized. They kind of say those are places that, will be lost to the Soviets. They'll follow the French Revolutionary model. And freedom just has to be preserved as a kind of, transatlantic or white project. And of course, we know that Arendt's thoughts about civil rights in this country were comparably kind of, outrageous in retrospect. So I take Arendt to be really kind of, saying some things openly that a lot of Cold War liberals believed, um, with the exception of the state of Israel, which all the Cold War liberals supported. Um, they really didn't think about the whole world as a place where freedom could go and equality could take root. And I take it that that really matters, because I can't understand, how we can't think of liberalism or Marxism as projects of global emancipation. And yet, ironically, these Cold War liberals are living at the time of maybe the greatest global emancipation ever, namely the decolonization of the world, and they don't see anything worth celebrating in it, precisely for the sake of liberalism. So that's why she's there.
Yeah, and it's a very fascinating section. How much time do you have before you're going?
Me, as whenever Ben wants to cut us off.
Okay, good. Then I have a final critical question that I'll save to the end, but I did want to follow up on that a little bit, because I read a reasonable number of reviews of your book, and very few people have commented extensively on your treatment of nationalism in the book.
Right.
Where you point out, really following Hobsbawm in a lot of ways, that nationalism has, of course, gotten a bad rap on the left, and I think, frankly, for good reason, right?
Sure.
But it can, of course, be associated with more emancipatory movements, whether you think about the French Revolution, and this is what Hobsbawm points out in The Age of Revolution, right? Every nationalist movement in Europe adopted the tricolor for a reason, right?
Right.
And then you point out that various national independence movements also kind of adopted this emancipatory egalitarian ethos underpinning them, in opposition to Western imperialism. And the Cold War liberals, again, with one notable exception, tended to look upon a lot of this with a great deal of scorn and reservation. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think this is a really helpful point in trying to think through two phenomena. One is the rise of new forms of nationalism today, and two, and maybe less significantly, but kind of cheekily, why it is that so many liberals today, or self-described liberals, despise or claim to despise identity politics, broadly speaking.
Great question. After 4 years of liberal discourse around Donald Trump, it would seem like liberalism and nationalism never go together. But then, it turns out that liberals invented nationalism in the 19th century, just like they helped in socialism.
Which is
Actually, probably the most.
Yeah, I was going to say is like one of the very funny things about the fact that, like, you talked about post-liberalism at the beginning, that like there's this whole strain of that is like, oh, liberalism is the devil, what you really want is nationalism. And
Exactly.
it's like something very historically funny about this, right? Like like as if like nationalism was something that's existed throughout human history and not something that came about precisely with the rise of liberalism.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. So there's the kind of post-liberals who think that there's a clean alternative, and then there are the liberals themselves who, mainly to kind of scapegoat Donald Trump for all our ills, pretend that nationalism is also a kind of pure alternative to what liberals believe, when in fact it's just a messier situation. I think probably the most, if you had to choose, the most influential liberal thinker of all time, I would put my money on Giuseppe Mazzini, whom most people have not heard of, but he was an early Italian nationalist. He lived under the oppression of the Austrian Empire until he had to flee, and he lived a few streets over in London from Marx, and he was a liberal, and he believed that Italy should get its own country, rather than suffering under basically Austrian imperialism. And his writings, which included terrorist manuals, since a lot of liberals used to also believe in violence, his writings were like super influential on all early nationalisms outside Eastern Europe, where there were just homegrown nationalist movements pretty early. But Indian nationalism, totally unthinkable without Mazzini. Zionism, Mazzini has a big impact
Fascinating.
on early Zionist thinkers, and really everywhere you go, you find that he's just super influential. Now, what I think distinguished his views from later nationalists is that he thought that nationalism and cosmopolitanism were not in conflict, because we just need a stepping stone from empire to humanity, and the nation would be it. And he also imagined, when he founded a nationalist organization called Young Italy, he founded one for Europeans called Young Europe, and he just thought, there's no reason emancipation projects at different scales can't interact and synergize. Now, he wasn't an ethno-nationalist, and of course, in the middle of the 20th century, what Cold War liberals are dealing with is ethno-nationalism. And when we think of Trump, we think of racism, and we don't think of liberal nationalism. But I guess I just want to, respond to, Matt's question and Ben's by saying, it's complicated. And, I guess in general, we might say that nationalism should be viewed with a lot of suspicion now,
Hmm.
but it still has an emancipatory possibility. And if we think that, international governance, especially economic governance, is neoliberal, then to me, it's not incredible to think that the only sites of resistance, at least initially, as in the old days of the Austrian Empire, are going to be in national projects, winning elections on the left in Brazil, or someday in the United States, or wherever, and then trying to establish a foothold for a more global emancipation from there. I mean, there's no one who's going to trouble international neoliberal governance except politicians who win nationally first, and claiming that there's a national project for voters. And so I don't see how the left can abandon nationalism even today, although of course they need to call out right-wing versions of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the like, I guess some of that depends a little bit about what we mean by abandoned nationalism, right? Like in other words, is it just that there's a sort of acceptance that in the world that you live in, you have to operate in nation states and sort of contest for power within nation states, which, as you said, I mean, that much seems undeniable, right? Or is there something beyond it to sort of how you rhetorically or
Right.
ideologically engage with, something that you might think of as, as nationalism, right? I mean, this is, Matt talked about, sort of had a reference at the end of his question to, identity politics, and
Right.
this is, I mean, look, this is the thing that like a lot of people who might sort of make a big deal about being capital L liberals in
Sure.
2023, they like, who who sort of might like ostentatiously refer to Locke or whatever, right? It's like they have a like the one thing I actually agree with those people on, right, is some of their critique of identitarianism and this sort of like insistence on this kind of cosmopolitan universalism that that I like, right? That seems very very positive to me, but it's but I mean, like, maybe just to kind of tie this back into the sort of core subject of Cold War liberalism and these thinkers that you're talking about in your book, I mean, one of the, like there is something interesting to be said about their relationship to like nationalism or patriotism, because you say, okay, like a lot of these people are Anglophiles, which makes some sense that that the UK is the great historic homeland of liberal thought, and you can maybe understand to a certain extent the extension of that to American nationalism, that as much as for all the horrors that have been perpetrated by American nationalism over the years, and American imperialism, at least the United States is sort of the ultimate, has kind of the ultimate civic, non-ethnic nationalism. So you can see what there is to like there from like a liberal cosmopolitan perspective. But then like the place where it gets really strange is that a lot of these thinkers that you're talking about also are into, or at least have huge soft spots for Zionism, which is like, well, hold on, right? Like I could understand the sort of liberal attraction in certain contexts to like civic nationalism, but I mean, this is just outright, ethnic nationalism on steroids. Like, how could you possibly, like what, what's the liberal case for that?
And if I could add just one follow-up.
Yeah,
Could you
sure.
maybe talk a little bit about how the legacy of the Holocaust also shaped this outlook? Because I think that that's this kind of tragic dimension to a lot of these figures that really comes to the fore in your book as well.
Well, it's an interesting question, both of them. I mean, I guess I'd say on the first point, that Israel was once a very different place. If you like, it was more Mazzinian. I think there was latently some religious energy and definitely ethnic solidarity, but many of its founders really envisioned it as an outpost of humanity for Jews, denied their own outpost in the midst of Polish or Ukrainian nationalism, just to take two prominent ones today, Hungarian nationalism, which has reverted now to the kind of Christian nationalism that made no place for Jews. And yet, even there, a lot of the Cold War liberals were not fully on board. Like Isaiah Berlin, Jacob Talmon, whom we haven't mentioned, but was like the bitterest critic of Rousseau and the French Revolution of his time. Really, wanted a kind of more Anglophile Zionism, but they were still, fundamentally very, enthusiastic about forgiving towards Zionism and all of its acts. And, partly that's just kind of ethnic solidarity on their part and a kind of just exception that they were willing to make for, something they liked and supported. And I guess, my response is that if they were willing to do that and see the virtues of 19th century liberalism with its mobilizational character and its concession to nationalism and violence, which obviously the founding of Israel required, why not the rest of decolonization?
Right.
Why not decolonization around the world? So, at a certain point, I sort of jokingly say maybe the trouble with Cold War liberals is not that they were Zionists, but that they weren't Zionists enough, meaning they weren't consistent in this attempt to envision a kind of liberal nationalism for everyone and not just for one group of people. Now, the Holocaust is harder to talk about because, Judith Shklar was directly affected in the sense that she had to flee in 1938 and actually went through the Far East before arriving in Canada. And others were like we've talked about Popper, who was an emigre as well. I mean, I think it's very hard to be historical about this because they did not write a lot or really almost at all about the Holocaust in their lives, especially in the crucial period of the 1940s and 50s. It seems very clear that they were concerned about the Soviet Union, but they while they celebrated the downfall of National Socialism, they did not talk in detail about its crimes. The lone example being this kind of non-liberal Hannah Arendt, and pretty late, once the state of Israel has decided, let's say in part for political reasons, to make something of the Holocaust. We know a lot about that history. Actually, there's very little discourse about the Holocaust in early Israel up until the Eichmann trial, when there's in part a political decision to bring attention to it for the sake of international legitimacy. So I personally wouldn't say that these people were kind of predisposed to Cold War liberalism because of their Jewish identity or the experience of the Jews. We know a lot of Jews who lived through the same period in the middle of the 20th century became enamored of socialism. And so really ideological choice prevails over identity. And I think, that takes us back to identity politics, which I think, we all want to keep in its place and put in its place.
Yeah, without a doubt. So I thought we could transition to some of the more ambiguous figures in your text, because a lot of the people that we've talked about so far, like Arendt and Pomper, have generally been pretty quintessential Cold War liberals in that they don't like the left very much, to put it bluntly, right? In any of its iterations. Popper obviously had a flirtatious period with socialism early on, but that's pretty much gone by the time, you know, you reach the open society period. But then there are other figures in the book that you bring to our attention. People like Isaiah Berlin, for example, or Lionel Trilling, where you point out that even though they eventually came down on the side of Cold War liberalism, there was always a bit of reluctance behind their decision to basically back that horse. And there was a kind of melancholic remembrance or recollection of a time period when liberalism was more optimistic and one was more hopeful, particularly on Trilling's part. But even in Berlin's seminal Two Concepts of Liberty essay, you point out that there's a little bit of taciturnity on him coming down in favor of negative liberty. So could you talk a little bit about these figures and why they backed the horse of Cold War liberalism, but never seemed entirely comfortable with it?
Well, Berlin's an interesting case because what I try to show is that while he becomes really famous, world famous for a very libertarian idea about liberalism, that it's oriented to kind of, securing non-interference, especially by the state, with private freedom, something that sounds very neoliberal, even though, Berlin may not himself have been a neoliberal in economic policy. Berlin, it turns out, cared a great deal about this revolution we were talking about earlier, where moderns adopt a view of the highest life for themselves, which is one of free self-creation. And he cared much more about that in a certain way than the kind of more libertarian arguments, for which he's still very famous in his Two Concepts of Liberty. Lionel Trilling is, I think, a much clearer example of this great ambivalence that certain Cold War liberals had about the philosophy that they were forging. He had been on the left, unlike Berlin in his youth, and I think it was traumatic for him. And what I try to show is that while he's celebrated, he still has a kind of big fan club of followers among liberals today. Trilling, kind of was in mourning for the fact that he had to abandon his more enthusiastic liberalism or, progressivism. And I try to show this by looking at his novel, but it's also there in some of the writings that made up this huge bestseller that he published in 1950 called The Liberal Imagination. And actually, I compare him a bit to someone you've mentioned earlier, Theodor Adorno, who is a Marxist, but is himself kind of in mourning.
Oh, yeah.
And, says, well, what's the point of philosophy? Well, it still exists contrary to Marx's last thesis on Feuerbach, because the moment to realize philosophy that Marx had dreamed of was missed. And, famously, Adorno says, maybe there's emancipation for the future, but not now. Well, Trilling was a lot like that, except he was a liberal, and he basically said liberalism should be thought about as a kind of, therapy for those who have undergone ideological trauma, who understand how risky emancipation is and want to kind of save themselves from the kind of dangers and threats of emancipation. But even in the midst of that counsel, he still kind of maintained a kind of, desire to memorialize the emancipation he was supposedly relinquishing. So what I try to show, all things considered, is that Trilling in a way is himself an amazing critic of what Cold War liberals were doing. He could never give up what he said was so dangerous.
Well, I want to go back to Isaiah Berlin, because this is really interesting. Thinking about that essay that both of you guys have mentioned, the Two Concepts of Liberty, and roughly this is, in fact, I think actually a little bit ironically, maybe given Berlin's own politics, like I think that this essay has had a massive influence on the right, because they all it's like, I don't know, as a guy who argues with a lot of right wingers, like I've heard a lot of them say a lot of things that tell me that if they haven't read the essay, they've read people who've read it. And and they've like, you know, inherited concepts from it, and like you sort of start telling them, it's like, no, actually I think socialism is, you know, expands human freedom or whatever, and they'll be like, oh, you must be talking about that like positive freedom, but like no, real freedom is this negative freedom. It's like, yeah, okay, you know, I know where you got that.
Yep.
And it is like worth dwelling. You know, you kind of said in passing, right? Like his own politics are certainly not libertarian or anything like that, right? But there's a good essay by the Marxist analytic philosopher Jacobin, who was Berlin's student and friend. You know, obviously disagreed ferociously about Marx and socialism and related subjects, but there's a good essay by him where he talks about that, and he sort of says, you know, this is like there's obvious kind of right wing argument that goes something like this: that the goal, the sort of like legitimate core goal of the state, is just to protect liberty, and alleviating poverty has nothing to do with liberty. Therefore, alleviating poverty isn't really part of the legitimate mission of the state, and it's not. And Berlin is somebody who didn't embrace the conclusion. You know, he was still a, you know, admirer of stuff like the New Deal in the United States. You know, he had, you know, he wanted to hold open space for, you know, for social democratic policy goals, but he did think. I mean, the point he's making is like no, but like this is still you know, he still thinks alleviating poverty doesn't do anything to, you know, essentially has nothing to do with freedom and this sort of core sense of liberty, and that's and so, you know, so the point, you know, even though it's not a libertarian one in his case, it's still a cautious one. That's like, okay, look, this other thing might be good to do to some extent. You got to be real careful while you do it, you know, that you're not jeopardizing you know, you're not jeopardizing liberty, because sort of redistributive efforts are always going to be in some kind of tension or conflict with liberty as he saw it. And this is, you know, I mean, this is something that I think tells us a lot about the psychology of, you know, even though I just said it was a big influence on the right, but, you know, of a lot of liberalism, you know, since then, that and you know, just to draw in the other person that I wanted to really make sure we hit, you know, before we get into our last part of the conversation, you know, one of, you know, something that was like maybe a little bit of a surprise for me in the book, and part of the reason I thought it'd be interesting to have you and Matt talk, is that you had, in a certain sense, a much more positive read on Rawls than I would have expected, you know, but you know, but even there, I think you do kind of ding him a little bit for, you know, for it's like, okay, we can kind of see this legacy of like, you know, worrying about, you know, like a quality being in tension with, you know, with negative liberty, and really wanting to prioritize that above all else, right? So it's like, even though I think overall you do have a pretty positive read of Rawls, it's still there's still this sense in which you see in him this evidence of this thing that, you know, you don't like from the evolution of the Cold War liberals.
Yeah. So, I mean, so to begin with, I think I would put the point about Berlin slightly differently,
Okay.
because,
Yep.
you know, I agree with what you said, but the fact is he never wrote about his social democratic commitments. You could read, you know, Two Concepts of Liberty and,
Right.
you know, think it's really about a critique of economic redistribution, and indeed, you know, many have. And so, you know, the way I would put it is, you know, now we're talking about what I, you know, refer to as this sort of double mismatch in the history of liberal theory, because you have a whole phase of liberal theory that's just out of sync with liberal practice in its time. You know, a lot of libertarian theory, even as liberals, in fact, after World War II, are creating the biggest, you know, most egalitarian, most redistributive states they have before or since. And then Rawls comes, and we can get into, you know, how good or bad he is, what his connections to Cold War liberalism are, but there's no doubt that he talks about redistribution. However, he does so at the very moment that it's being upended, in fact, by liberals who are embracing neoliberalism. So, Rawls's redistributive commitments are never, you know, more honored than the day before he published A Theory of Justice than any day since. It's like, what a sad thing to write a book and the world moves the other way. And so I think we, as liberals or leftists, we have to kind of figure out what to do about this mismatch. But, I guess I would say that I want to be much harder on Berlin, because what if his failure to even talk about what kind of institutional picture, what demands the state may justifiably make on citizens, including enormously high taxes of the era in which he wrote Two Concepts of Liberty. What if he was, not to blame, but part of the reason why, given all of the, right-wing fanboys he has for his ideas, part of the explanation for why it is that neoliberalism followed Cold War liberalism. Now, I'll let Matt talk about Rawls, but I'll just say we're in a really interesting moment with Rawls, because there are these amazing critical accounts that try to historicize Rawls, like most notably Katrina Forrester's book. I have a bit of a soft spot for him, while noting, in the very brief things I say about him in this new book, that there are some legacies of Cold War liberalism in Rawls, but I'm with Matt and thinking that, look, it's any port in the storm right now, and in a neoliberal era, I think we should assemble all the resources we have, whether they're within liberalism or on the outskirts of it. And Rawls, like Mill, can be reread as a socialist, and if that's true, then I think we should number him in the kind of canon of those with whom we are with whom we read to mount some resistance to what liberalism has become in our time.
Yeah, I mean, the point about Rawls and socialism really reinforces what you were saying about the timing, because in that case the mismatch is even more extreme, right? Because Rawls sort of his philosophical evolution towards his reticent socialism, right? Towards the comes at the maybe low water mark in the last 150 years for the real life prospects of socialism. I mean, to the point that I think he was too sick at this time to actually go collect it, but he was actually given I think a National Medal of Freedom or something by Bill Clinton, who I'm sure didn't read or care about any of this, and Rawls wasn't the kind of person who would make waves by declining it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, he was aware of the kind of paradox that you were talking about, that at the very moment when liberal egalitarianism was kind of taking off in terms of its theoretical sophistication, the opportunities to actually realize it had really fallen away. And I think, again, this is what really adds a kind of gravitas to your book, because there is a sense of the road not traveled in the book that I don't think appears in some of your earlier works. And it adds this real... Frankly, it just makes me mad in some ways. I'm just going to be blunt about that, right? Because I think that was the road that we should travel. But before I dive into asking a question about liberal egalitarianism and your kind of endpoint in the text, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we went down the wrong road. Let's put it this way. Because you do point out that in a kind of perverse inversion of Marxist expectations, material conditions on the ground in the 1950s and the 1970s were really changing in a lot of liberal states. Now, there are all kinds of criticisms that any Marxist can and should make of the welfare state, but there is no denying, as you say, that in many ways it was a step forward for equality, at least in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, other districts. But then in the 1960s and the 1970s, depending on when you want to demarcate it, I think that Perlstein's right that the Nixon election is really where you start to see things go the wrong direction, but you can choose Reagan if you want. A lot of people do. You really see Cold War liberalism come into its moment, not just as this kind of intellectual niche that's redefining liberalism in a more conservative way, but as people who have the ear of presidents, heads of state, major political actors and economic actors, and ultimately they succeed in reconstructing the world according to their vision, which I think is a very bad vision. So that's again why it's the road we shouldn't have traveled.
I think so. I mean, I guess I want to um, say that. Well, I mean, what I try to imply in the book is that it was a short step from Cold War liberalism, which was kind of an unstable position in the end, to these successor positions, neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and those actually turn out to be utopian projects. The
That's for
very
sure.
sort
Yeah.
of thing that Cold War liberals allegedly were most concerned with denouncing, and yet, once you've taken such a big step away from 19th century emancipatory liberalism, you've taken a step very close to neoliberalism and neoconservatism, these kind of dominant ideologies, even right now. And so I fault Cold War liberals for, in a sense, being destructive. Not themselves being neoliberals or neoconservatives. Some evolved into those things, but really preparing the ground intellectually and, kind of tarnishing earlier versions of liberalism. So then the whole situation is just further right and, let's say prepared to take a step towards those more kind of disastrous ideologies of our time.
Sometimes very overtly also. I mean, you can
Yeah.
read Hayek or von Mises on John Stuart Mills, and one of the things that they consistently emphasize is just what a disaster his later work was,
Right.
because it deviated so stridently from this kind of classical liberal possessive ethic. But
Exactly.
yeah, I mean, I think it's really quite stunning that we ended up taking this road, and that's one of the reasons I like the book. But you end with this kind of observation or editorializing where you say that if liberals do not reconstruct or rethink their credo, they're unlikely to see it survive into the 20th century. And then you had a proviso, which is that, and besides, survival isn't good enough. So I've always been interested in asking you, what do you think would be good enough? I've kind of planted my flag on liberal socialism. Ben,
Sure.
would characterize himself as democratic socialist. I think that you've characterized yourself as a kind of left Hegelian at other points. But in terms of brass tacks, right, moving beyond
Sure.
theory, what kind of policy changes or international changes would you like to see to get us to a system that's not just worthy of survival, but worthy of loyalty and fidelity?
Well, I'm where you are, but I think liberalism in the late 19th century and really running through Rawls, these are all kind of so-called new liberal projects, kind of share something with Marxism, which is a kind of economism and a focus on kind of distribution and questions of justice. And I think those are totally, important. But what I like most about the early liberals is that their commitment to emancipation was about existential freedom. It was about saying we need to figure out what the fair and just and conditions are for freedom. But what matters most is freedom individually and collectively to make the world interesting and new
Right.
through experiments. And that to me is that's the holy grail. And of course, since liberalism has to be cosmopolitan, it has to be available to all on equal terms on a world scale. And so I'm a liberal socialist, but I just want to kind of make clear that the reason why we're liberals and socialists is because of our perfectionist commitments to freedom exercised individually or collectively for the sake of novelty, making the world different and interesting, so that we can learn, others can learn. So that's still pretty abstract, but to me, something like the school is a microcosm, at least if it's not a site of indoctrination, but a site of equipping children to live their lives freely, of what
Right.
all societies should be everywhere, always.
Fantastic. I also
Yeah,
want to say
that's-
I have
yeah,
a title
that's-
for your next book. If you really want to piss people off, just call yourself a liberal Marxist or liberal Marxism, right? I can guarantee you
Absolutely.
people
I've
get angry at
started
me
to
for
use
liberal
that
socialism.
phrase, I've started to use liberal Marxism because it helps capture that liberals care about the conditions for enjoying freedom and rights, and not just freedom and rights themselves on paper and long since. And then there's just a debate about what it really takes to kind of honor those conditions and bring them about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, New York Times bestseller #1. I guarantee you, liberal
Absolutely.
Marxism, right?
Well, didn't Jonah Goldberg? Or no, he
Yeah, I was
wrote
gonna
liberal
say that
fascism.
Liberal fascism.
everybody,
yeah.
But of
everybody
course,
who
Marxism was in that book.
you know, 999 out of 1,000 people who bought liberal Marxism would think it was something else, but
Right, exactly. Well, that's okay.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, sounds good. Well, so the book once again is called Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals, and the Making of Our Times. And it's yeah, it's really good. It's very like, I mean, it's sort of not you know, obviously it's building an argument, but you know, it's also just like a really interesting kind of tour through these figures, you know, get to feel a little bit like you're taking a seminar on it. So people should definitely check that out. Matt's most recent book is the How-To Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism, a tribute to Michael Brooks. So go read that too. And thank you guys both so much.
Thank you. It's a huge privilege to be on with both of you.
All right,
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So that is Samuel Moyn and Matt McManus. And having gotten, you know, like I feel like in the last hour and a half, we've really imbibed a lot of intellectual protein and, you know, vitamins and nutrients. So now, like, I think we could just kind of gorge ourselves with some like Halloween candy that's on deep discount because it's late November, and we're just gonna eat some garbage. We've got you know, we've got some Ben Shapiro clips. We've got a Alex Jones video game. It's the post game for patrons, so we are gonna have a little bit of fun. So if you are already a patron, you should have the link in your email. If you are not, no time like the present. Patreon.com/Ben Burgis. We will see you over there in 2 to 3 minutes. Left is best.